It's time for the chip race.
For strategy this week, we welcome back to the show Millions Rio champion, Super Tuesday specialist, PPL leaderboard champion, and most recently, the Venom champion, Marty Mathis. Welcome back.
Hey guys, thanks for having me. Small correction, I did chop the Venom heads up and I lost heads up. This is the DTO curse, so you can't go Venom champion on the resume.
Well, look, the guy who comes second sort of wins because he maximizes the whole concept of a tournament anyway.
Yeah, the winner ends the tournament with all the chips, but only a small fraction of the money, so he's actually the biggest loser.
Good stuff. Well, listen, this hand comes from the Venom. It was a fascinating one. You chopped this for 1.3 million. First of all, congratulations. At this point in the tournament, there were 12 people left. You were 10 of 12, so certainly no foregone conclusion. You had 67 million chips, roughly 28 big blinds at big blind 2.4 million. The villain, Silskyer, min raises to 4.8 million in the cutoff. You defend the big blind with the ace of hearts, six of clubs. Nothing interesting there, so I recommend we head straight to the flop. It comes the Queen of Hearts, Jack of Spades, 10 of Hearts. You check, and he bets 2.3 million into 12.8 million, just 18%. He, of course, has a huge range advantage on this board, but it is a board that you catch a piece of a lot too. Getting 7.5 to 1, you've got ace high, the gutter to the nuts, and a backdoor nut flush draw. You decide to call. Marty, this is a situation we face out there on the streets an awful lot more these days. With the help of solvers, bet sizings definitely got a bit more intricate. The really small bet here tests you in a way that a larger bet wouldn't. To a button clicky, a third or half pot, you can just toss this hand away pretty happily. Yeah. But this sizing, it would be a mistake to let it go. Can you speak to your thought process in this spot and also to that idea more generally?
Yeah, so obviously you spoke about his range advantage on this board. I'm not really having any of the sets in my range. I might not even have all of the queen jack suited or even queen 10 suited in my range. I like versus an active opener, I might just be reshoving those pre-flop some percentage of the time, especially given like my stack situation. And so the small bet, he retains his equity so well across further streets. So it makes a lot of sense that he can just make a very small bet here. His equity advantage in the hand really isn't going to shift. There's not really many runouts on this board where I can kind of change my fate. There's no card that gives a massive equity shift other than maybe like an offsuit jack. So in terms of his sizing here, or just any player choosing a small sizing here, I think it's really good because you can just keep putting that pressure on across further streets. You can control your equity with your medium strength hands. And so I really like to size. Obviously, I know that I have to call with the ace of hearts, but with some other parts of my range, like some different gutters, maybe something that doesn't have an ace high, because it feels like my most natural calls are my king X within my range that are able to continue across later streets rather than the ace X, because the king X obviously has the open-ended. So the ace X that I call here probably would pretty much only be the ace X with a heart, because all the ace X that have some kind of pair, ace 10, ace jack, ace queen, those are all going in pre. Obviously, I have some ace 9 offsuits. That'll probably make up some of my calling range as well, but it's hard for me to find continues on this board that are going to want to continue to further pressure across later streets.
Yeah, I'm keen not to push our audience too far in the stationary direction on this one. Dara, the ace of hearts, as Marty said there, does seem crucial, not just because it has backdoor nut potential, but also it has bluff potential as the nut blocker if one heart peels off. Can you speak to range construction there to follow on from what Marty said?
Yeah, well, you both pretty much said that the pre-flop raiser has a fairly significant range advantage on this. And when you plug it into a solver, that's borne out. The solver breaks the equity 63-37 in favor of the villain in this case. So he has really all the advantages here. He has nutted advantage, he has range advantage, he's in position. So we're going to have to just check fold a lot. That said, I mean, with the ace of hearts, we obviously have a clear continue. Interestingly enough, I gave the solver a few different choices in terms of size it could use, and it's split between the size he used and a bigger size, and it actually uses the bigger size more frequently because the solvers typically, when they see a clear range advantage, and this is a very clear range advantage, they like to use the bigger size. And if he does bet the bigger size, we actually have to give up with the ace of hearts. But when he chooses a smaller size, we absolutely have to continue with the ace of hearts.
And I obviously thought that as well. But another thing I took into consideration, like if I'm in his shoes and like the stack to pot ratio is really low and there is a significant amount of ICM pressure, even at this point between the two tables. And my thoughts are that he doesn't need to use as big of a size all the time with some parts of the range that the solver says, because I have both more auto folds pre and auto folds on the flop that I might not continue that maybe the solver says I should in a vacuum.
Yeah, that's a very good point. ICM changes things considerably, and the way ICM typically changes post-flop strategy is it allows the player who covers to bet more frequently, but it forces the sizings down and makes him want to use a smaller size. So actually taking ICM into consideration, it may be better for him to bet his entire range at the smaller size. Interestingly enough, if we go outside of ICM, Marty mentioned that this might be his only ace high call, given that he has the ace of hearts, and the solver bears that out. The solver will occasionally throw in a call with this specific hand when it has the six of hearts, but obviously the six of hearts is not as significant as the ace of hearts, and it will still usually fold even when it has the six of hearts. This is a mistake I see a lot of my students make. They look at a board like this and they think, well, my ace high might be good and I have a gut shot, so I just have to continue. But you're actually calling far too much if you're calling all your ace highs.
Yeah, and as we already talked about, it's such a hard board to continue on given his advantage, and even more so back into the realm of ICM. It just makes it really hard for me to continue on further streets, which while we get to the turn, there's a small glimmer of hope.
Indeed, it does. Well, to the turn, it comes the four of spades, putting up a second flush draw. Board now reads queen of hearts, jack of spades, 10 of hearts, four of spades. Pot is 17.4 million. Marty, again, you check, and this time the villain checks back. Dara, being at such a range and nut disadvantage as we spoke about, we obviously can't find any leads here in Marty's shoes, I don't think. But what can we garner from the villain's check back that can maybe help inform how we respond now on a lot of rivers?
Yeah, well, when we said the villain has a significant range advantage, that's when the flop comes down. But after the flop goes check, bet, call, our range has strengthened in the sense that we have a lot of just give ups on the flop, and we get to the turn without all of those. So we have a stronger range now. His range hasn't really strengthened at all because he should just be auto c-betting this board because it's such a good board for him on the flop. So therefore, by the time we get to the turn, our range has strengthened fairly considerably. It's now closer to 55-45. So because of that, he does actually have to check back quite a lot now. He can't just keep firing.
Interesting. Well, Marty, you obviously called the flop getting a huge price, so there isn't a huge onus to realise equity there. Given the dynamics, how balanced versus how greedy you were feeling, were you anticipating some evil exploitative thoughts on some rivers?
So to give a little context, and I kind of hate to talk about these things in general, objectively, I'm not sure how much I believe this, but in the moment, I just felt this kind of momentum almost. I had previously been 11-12, 3 hands before. I had just 13 big blinds. I doubled up, then I got a 4-bet shove in, and then the blinds went up. So we're at the new blind level, and I had kind of resigned my fate to, am I going to blind out of this thing? And all of a sudden, I'm on the turn, he checks back, and I'm just thinking, if a heart comes, what's my plan? If a heart doesn't come, what's my plan? And I decided I'm going to look at his timing. I'm going to see what the river is, obviously. But I kind of decided on a heart. I kind of instinctively decided on the turn that I'm not going to go for the small bluff. I'm going to go for the big bluff. It was kind of just like this evil thought running through my head. It's sometimes hard to ignore that, for better or worse.
Yeah, well, I'm sure we've all felt the wind at our backs from time to time at the poker table. To the river, you did spoiler it, but that's okay. It was always going to be an action card because I'm sure our listeners otherwise would have been like, why the hell are they using this as an investing hand? It comes the 8 of hearts. The final board reads queen of hearts, jack of spades, 10 of hearts, 4 of spades, 8 of hearts. Pot is still 17.4 million. Flop flush draw gets there. Any 9 now makes a straight. And we, of course, have the nut blocker. You decide to check. You spoke a moment ago to maybe a bigger plan.
I think there are some merits to a lot of my options on the river. I definitely think just like a small block bet is pretty effective to fold out middle pairs, some things that he would bet flop with. I can fold out some better ace highs. I definitely think I get immediate bluff success just making like a small block bet in my shoes. But that's not what I decided.
No, not at all. You do check, and the villain bets 13.8 million into the 17.4 million. So roughly 80% with just ace high. You obviously can call here. So the question is, Do you pull the trigger on this big bluff representing the nuts? Well, spoiler alert, you do. You shove for 60 million total, applying maximum pressure, laying the villain almost exactly 2-1 on a call. Marty, talk us through all the factors that led you to this decision. And I suppose to be more specific, because we've talked about it in a more vague way already, what target hands did you feel like you could get to fold?
The 9. I think he's folding the 9 always. If we look at the hearts on the board, there's a queen of hearts, there's a 10 of hearts, and there's the 8 of hearts on the board. And so when we're looking at the combinations of flushes he can possibly hold when I have the ace of hearts in my hand, he has some king X suited combos basically. And I feel like those aren't always going to be a check on the turn either. I feel like the bad king X suited, like the low king X of hearts, he's probably going to want to continue to barrel in that spot. So when I'm thinking about the composition of his range on the river, I'm just not seeing many flushes in general. Having the ace of hearts is very significant. In his shoes on the turn, the hands that he wants to bet check with would be some of these ace high flush draws like ace 5 of hearts, some of these kinds of hands that he doesn't want to get maybe blown off the equity, or he can check back and still realize very well. I just don't see a line where he has many flushes in it by the river. When I'm thinking about the composition of both of our ranges, I definitely have the flush advantage. So looking at what the two of us has after he makes that bet, I just don't see a flush being played that way, basically.
Fair enough. Well, Dara, you did find some interesting stuff in the PO analysis on this one, I know. Can you break down some of that stuff for us?
As Marty said, leading here it makes sense too. And actually PO mixes between leads and checks with Marty's specific hand. It mostly checks, it has to be said. It's about 90-10. So that's the first thing. Facing the bet, this was the most interesting part for me because when I looked at this hand, I thought, yeah, this is an obvious bluff. We've done a few river check raise bluffs in the past, and they've always featured this idea of having a nut blocker, and the ace of hearts therefore seems to be a very significant card. But actually, when PO faces a bet, it actually folds this hand, but it check raises a6 with the 6 of hearts. So bizarrely, it prefers having the 6 of hearts than the ace of hearts. I was intrigued by this, so I dug into it a bit more. And the reason for this seems to be that when PO is playing the imposition player's range, it has very few bluffs or thin value bets that have the ace of hearts in them. When it has the flush, when it has the ace high flush, it overbets the river. It doesn't use this size. And when it doesn't have the flush, but it has the ace of hearts, typically it has something else like a pair, like ace jack with the ace of hearts. And it checks a lot of those hands behind. So actually, it doesn't use his size at all very much with the ace of hearts. So therefore, it doesn't see the ace of hearts as a significant blocker. It does have some flushes like 7-6 of hearts that it will bet at this size on the river. So therefore it feels that the 6 of hearts is a better blocker to choose to do the bluff check raise with. Now, this was without ICM. One of the advantages of Marty's check shove on the river is basically puts the villain in a very difficult ICM spot where he actually needs a lot more equity than he would if there were no ICM to make the call in the end. So therefore he has to fold more. So given that it's pretty close anyway, when we factor in ICM, I think check raising this hand becomes better.
One of the things I was thinking about when I saw this hand first was obviously our opponent to begin with could have ace king, but then once checking the turn, that seems less likely. And then I got to thinking, well, if you're up against somebody like Marty who's capable like this, is there any benefit to putting a hand like ace king into your checking back turn range because you're actually looking to exploit him and have more hands that can be actually called to this play on the river?
I thought the same thing as well, and I don't know who Silskier is. He has the same screen name across every website, but he's played high stakes for basically as long as I can remember. So for me to discount him being able to check a hand like king 9 or ace king on the turn to try to get like a river bet from me and get a raise in, that's definitely not out of the realm of possibility in any way. A lot of people talk about how shit everyone is at poker, but I've met so many poker players traveling around. I've talked poker with so many people. And the thing is, like, everybody's good at something. Everybody has their strengths. Everybody has their weaknesses. And so I think what I do is I almost give people too much credit sometimes in terms of thinking what they're capable of. Like the mutual respect, I know how much work I put in, and I know the things I'm capable of that nobody thinks that I could do. So I kind of extend that respect to other people. So I never like fully discount anyone or think that, nah, there's no way that guy could do that, because that's led me down a wrong path several times.
Really interesting. Well, I do have one final note here, and I want to come to you on this one. When you sent us this hand, you put a little note attached. You said, I have a long history of suicide bluffs and how they seem to be working a lot more lately after a decade of failure. So in light of that, one, why do you think they're working more often? This bluff, by the way, does get through, and that's why Marty goes on to chop this event. Why do you think they're working more of late? And I suppose as well, and I think this is really crucial to this hand, 12 left, huge amounts of money up top. It's a sort of a once-in-a-lifetime spot for a lot of players. I know you've been there many times before, Marty, but for your opponent, even if he's a regular to high stakes, this is still going to be a huge moment in his poker year, if not his poker decade. So
yeah,
is putting all the pressure on somebody in that spot and maybe eking out more folds than you're meant to, part and parcel of how you find value?
Definitely. Obviously, the last 2 years have gone really well, but it hasn't always been easy. There's been a decade of failed suicide bluffs in these high equity spots for me. And you kind of have this cloud over your head raining down on you. Just, should I have done that? Or that was such a punt, or that was so bad. But I think a strength that I've had in my mentality is just realizing that every tournament is an independent event. You play it the best you can, and just not to be afraid to keep pulling the trigger, because it's almost, I had so many failed bluffs for a while. It's almost like you start chasing losses in terms of just like you're trying to get even on your bluffs. And Brazil, the Rio score, everybody obviously saw the big bluff at the final table I made against Bruno with the 4-6 of clubs when we were 1 and 2 in chips. But even prior to that, there were 10 people left on the final table bubble, and I laid down an even bigger bluff on them. So I think the way that I'm constructing my bluffs are more grounded in solid logic, but it's also this confidence that comes with being able to just like trust your decision making. As Dara said, like my intuition wasn't spot on in this spot. Like having the 6 of hearts is better than having the ace of hearts. It's not so significant of a blocker. But you can't always question yourself to death. And I think part of my success and my longevity in poker is just having confidence in my decision making. And it's not easy to keep. And I'm like everyone. I mean, I probably tell myself 3 times a month after, like, you're the worst fucking player that's ever played poker, and like talking down to myself. And you kind of have that devil on your shoulder, but at the same time, you have to have confidence in yourself. And I feel like it really boils down to that.
Great stuff. A breathtaking hand in a key moment that led to a $1.3 million score. I know Dara and I both enjoyed it very much. Marty Mathis, thank you so much.
Thanks, David. Thanks, Dara, for having me.
Thanks, Marty.